I am Captain Laura Carr, 34 years old, and a Nurse Corps officer in the United States Army. For 10 years in the service, I have used my bare hands to apply pressure to the jagged, bleeding wounds of strangers in the Middle East. But the most brutal battle of my life began with a simple phone beep at 4 p.m., right here at home. Standing outside the emergency room where my grandmother was literally coughing up blood, I swiped across my cracked screen to read a text from my own father. It said, "You are already there. We will come if she actually passes away." I gripped my phone so hard the edges of the case dug deep into my palm. They were throwing their own mother away like a bag of winter trash, expecting me to just clean up the body so they could waltz in and split the house. What they did not know was that just before her last breath, my grandmother pressed a USB drive into my hand that would seal the death warrant for their greed. If you have ever been slapped in the face by your own flesh and blood when you needed them most, let me know what state you are listening from. Hit follow. This is how I took them to a court-martial. The digital clock on the gray office wall clicked to 4:32 p.m., the red numbers glowing like a warning light. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a lukewarm cup of black coffee that had developed a thin, oily film on top. The barracks were quiet, just the distant hum of the ventilation system and the occasional heavy tread of boots in the hallway. Then my iPhone started vibrating against the aluminum desk surface. The rattling sound was sharp, demanding attention. I saw the caller ID UPMC Presbyterian, ICU. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I have spent 10 years in the Army Nurse Corps, and I have heard the death rattle in field hospitals under the desert sun. But the sound of that phone was different. It felt like a sniper's red dot settling right between my eyes. I picked it up on the second ring. My voice came out clinical, clipped, the way a captain's voice should. "Captain Carr speaking." It was Dr. Fitzpatrick. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He spoke in rapid-fire bursts, like a machine gun. Perforated bowel, sepsis. The infection was screaming through her 84-year-old system. "We need her on the table in an hour, Laura, or she's gone," he said. I grabbed a paper napkin from under my coffee cup. My hand was steady, but my brain was a storm. I pressed a black ballpoint pen into the napkin, scrawling 3 words. ICU. Critical. Surgery. I pressed so hard the ink bled through and the cheap paper tore. I stood up, my chair screeching across the linoleum floor, and the movement knocked my coffee over. The dark liquid spread across the desk, dripping onto the floor, but I didn't stop to grab a towel. I was already out the door. Actually, looking back, I think I knew even then that I was heading into a different kind of war. By 4:51 p.m., I was sitting in the cab of my Ford F-150. The leather seats were freezing, and the smell of stale coffee and old gym clothes filled the small space. Outside, a miserable Pittsburgh winter was doing its worst. The sky was the color of a bruised lung, and the windshield wipers were struggling to shove gray, muddy slush out of my line of sight. My fingers were fumbling as I opened the family group chat on my phone. The group was named The Carrs, a title that felt like a joke. My parents, John and Diane, were both in there. I typed with my thumbs, the letters coming out in a blur of urgency. "Nana is in emergency surgery at UPMC, red status, sepsis. I need you both here now." I hit send. I stared at the screen, my breath fogging up the cold air in the truck. 2 seconds later, the little blue checks appeared. Read by John Carr. Read by Diane Carr. I waited. I watched for the 3 little gray dots that would mean someone was typing a response, a prayer, or even just an "on my way." Nothing happened. The screen stayed blank. The only sound was the rhythmic thud-thud of the wipers and the heater blowing a dry, dusty wind into my face. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard the skin over my knuckles was stretched white and translucent. They had seen the message. They knew their mother was dying on a stainless steel table less than 20 miles away. And they chose silence. I hit the gas, the tires spinning for a second on the slick asphalt before catching. I was heading toward the Forbes Avenue exit, weaving through the heavy afternoon traffic. At 5:02 p.m., I hit a red light at a major intersection. The city was glowing with brake lights and neon signs for cheap diners and drugstores. Suddenly, the phone in the cup holder pulsed once. A single, short vibration. I snatched it up before the screen even fully lit up. It was an SMS from my father's number. I expected a change of heart, maybe a "we're leaving now," or "traffic is bad." Instead, the words on the screen felt like a physical blow to the stomach. It said, "You are already there. We will come if she actually passes away." I sat there as the light turned green and a line of cars began to honk behind me. I couldn't move. My lungs felt like they had collapsed. Here's the thing about family. Sometimes the people who are supposed to be your anchor are the ones trying to drown you. They weren't coming because it wasn't convenient. They were treating a human life, the woman who raised them, like a chore they could outsource to the daughter in uniform. I felt a hot, metallic taste in the back of my throat. The taste of pure, unadulterated rage mixed with a grief so sharp it felt like shrapnel. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and roared through the intersection. By 5:15 p.m., I was pushing through the heavy glass doors of the UPMC Presbyterian ICU. The transition was jarring. The freezing wind of the street was replaced by the suffocating sterile heat of the hospital. The air smelled of industrial-strength bleach and that weird, sweet scent of floor wax and sickness. I walked up to the reception desk, my OCPs, my combat uniform, feeling heavy and out of place among the scrubs and lab coats. Bethany, an older nurse with tired eyes, looked up from her computer. She saw my rank. She saw the car name tape on my chest, and her expression softened into that pitying look healthcare workers give to the families of the doomed. She pushed an intake form across the plexiglass divider. "Captain, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "The surgeon is already inside. I need you to fill out the family contact section." She leaned in a little closer. "Is there anyone else on the way? I can tell security to keep the lane open for them." I looked down at the paper. There was a big, empty box labeled "Family Members Present" or "In Transit." I felt the weight of the USB drive Nana had shoved into my hand weeks ago, though I hadn't looked at it yet. I looked Bethany in the eye, and I lied. It was a soldier's lie, told to keep the line from breaking. "Yes," I said, my voice cracking just enough to sound human. "They're on their way. They're just stuck in the snow." I signed my name with a hand that finally started to shake. I was officially alone in this, standing guard over a dying woman while the rest of my bloodline waited for her to become a corpse so they could start counting the silver. Waiting. Room D7 was a windowless box designed to swallow time. The walls were a pale, sickly shade of beige that looked gray under the rhythmic hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. 6 vinyl chairs were bolted to the floor in a semicircle, their surfaces cracked and worn from decades of desperate people leaning into them. I sat in the corner, my back pressed against the cold drywall, feeling the heavy fabric of my OCPs, my duty uniform, rubbing against my skin like sandpaper. At 6:11 p.m., the double aluminum doors hissed open, and I watched the gurney carrying Nana disappear into the sterile white glare of the surgical hallway. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the CARS group chat. My thumbs felt heavy, moving through a thick fog of exhaustion. I sent the update. "Nana is on the table now. Surgery started." I watched the screen. 6:14 p.m., read by John Carr, read by Diane Carr. I waited for a heart emoji, a praying, or even a simple, "keep us posted." Nothing. The screen just stared back at me, as empty as the room. Every 30 minutes, I repeated the ritual, acting as a one-woman emergency broadcast system. I was a radar station sending out signals into a dead, silent vacuum of space. They were there, somewhere in their comfortable house, watching the same blue checks appear on their screens. And they chose to say absolutely nothing. By 8:15 p.m., the silence in the room began to feel physical, like a weight pressing on my chest. I stood up just to hear my own boots hit the floor. I walked over to the vending machine in the corner, the motor whirring with a lonely, mechanical grind. I dug a crumpled $2 bill out of my pocket and fed it into the slot. A flimsy styrofoam cup dropped with a hollow thud, and a stream of dark, burnt-smelling liquid splashed into it. I wrapped my hands around the cup, welcoming the sharp sting of the heat against my palms. I needed to feel something other than the cold. An elderly woman in a threadbare wool coat, sitting 3 chairs down, watched me. Her eyes were soft, filled with that heavy shared understanding you only find in hospital basements. "Are you here all alone, dear?" she asked, her voice thin and wavering. She looked at my uniform, then back at the empty chairs around me. "Aren't your parents coming?" I felt a flash of hot shame prickle at the back of my neck. I forced my mouth into a rigid, professional smile, the kind I used when briefing a colonel I didn't like. "They're on their way," I lied, the words tasting like the burnt coffee in my hand. "They're just having trouble finding a spot in the parking garage." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't believe me. She reached over and placed a single folded napkin on the armrest next to me, a small gesture of humanity that my own flesh and blood couldn't be bothered to provide. I couldn't stay seated. I began to pace the narrow strip of linoleum, my shadow stretching and shrinking under the flickering lights. Across the hallway, near the elevators, a large family had gathered. They were speaking in low, urgent Spanish, huddled together like a single organism. The father was rubbing his son's shoulder. The mother was clutching a set of rosary beads, her lips moving in silent prayer. They had a tribe. They had a front line. I looked down at my phone again, a masochistic reflex I couldn't stop. I opened Facebook. There it was, my mother's profile picture at the top of my feed. Diane Carr liked a photo. It was a picture of a neighbor's golden retriever wearing a raincoat. My mother was sitting in her recliner, scrolling through mindless garbage, liking pet photos, while her mother-in-law was having her abdomen sliced open 20 miles away. She had enough emotional energy for a dog in a coat, but not for a phone call to her only daughter who was standing guard over the dying. The betrayal didn't feel like a sudden stab. It felt like a slow, freezing tide rising around my ankles, turning my heart into a block of ice. 9:47 p.m. The fluorescent light directly above me gave one final violent flicker and died, leaving my corner of the room in a dull, oppressive shadow. At that exact moment, the surgical doors burst open. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet ward. Dr. Fitzpatrick stepped out. He wasn't wearing his white coat anymore, just his blue surgical scrubs. And there was a dark, jagged smear of blood on his V-neck collar. He didn't look for a clipboard. He didn't look at the other families. He looked straight at me. He reached up and pulled his surgical mask down to his chin, leaving it hanging there like a white flag of surrender. I've seen that look on the faces of field medics when the heart monitor goes flat and the room goes still. I didn't need him to speak. I saw the way his shoulders slumped, the way his hands hung heavy and useless at his sides. The military nurse in me calculated the outcome before he even crossed the room. Our final line of defense had crumbled, and I was the only soldier left on the battlefield to witness the fallout. If you've ever sat in a room full of people but felt completely invisible because the ones who were supposed to be there simply didn't show up, please leave a comment with the word "Guardian" and tell me which city you're listening from. It helps me know I'm not the only one who has had to stand guard alone. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to follow how I handled the aftermath of that night. I stepped into the post-op recovery room, but the atmosphere had shifted. The frantic energy of the surgical team was gone, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. The ventilators had been disconnected, and the room was devoid of that rhythmic, mechanical sighing that usually signifies a fighting chance. Nana was just there, lying beneath a mountain of sterile white sheets that made her look impossibly small, like a child lost in a snowbank. I walked to the side of the bed and reached out, my fingers brushing against her forehead. Her skin still held a faint, lingering warmth. A fragile ghost of the woman who used to bake sourdough bread every Sunday and tell me that a uniform was a badge of honor, not a burden. I took her hand. It was rough, the skin papery and mapped with blue veins, calloused from 50 years of scrubbing cast iron pans and pulling weeds in the garden. I pressed her palm against my cheek, feeling the stillness. There were no tears, not yet. My military training had kicked in. that cold, internal vault where I store the things that hurt too much to process in real time. I leaned down, my lips inches from her ear, and I whispered, my voice low and serrated like a blade. I'm going to protect what you left behind, Nana. I won't let them tear it apart. I'm going to make them answer for this. I turned and walked out into the hallway. The air was drafty, smelling of industrial floor wax, and the faint, copper scent of blood that always seems to cling to trauma wards. I pulled my phone out and dialed my father. It rang 3 times. Long, lonely tones that echoed in my head. Then, a click. I could hear the faint, distinct chink of ice against a glass on the other end. He was at home, probably in his leather recliner with a scotch in his hand. "Dad," I said. My voice was a flat line. "She's gone. She didn't make it off the table." There was a silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds. It wasn't the silence of shock or grief. It was the silence of someone checking a clock. Then, John Carr's voice came through the speaker, deep and utterly devoid of emotion. "Right. Well, I suppose we'll have to deal with the arrangements tomorrow." I felt a surge of heat crawl up my neck. My grip on the phone tightened until the plastic casing groaned. "That's it? That's all you have to say? You didn't even ask if I was okay, Dad. I've been standing here alone for 6 hours." I heard him exhale, a sharp, irritated sound. "Laura, honestly, you're a combat nurse. You deal with bodies and death in the desert all the time. This is literally what you do for a living. You're fine." Then came the sound that felt like a gunshot, a dial tone. The call had lasted exactly 47 seconds. He had just weaponized my own service against me, using my sacrifice as a reason to ignore my pain. My chest felt tight, like someone was winding a wire around my ribs, but I didn't stop. I dialed my mother. Diane picked up on the second ring, and immediately the loud, obnoxious theme music of Wheel of Fortune filled my ear. Vanna White was probably clapping for a contestant while my grandmother was being wheeled to the morgue. "Mom," I said, "Nana passed away." I heard her tut-tut through the phone. "Oh, well, honestly, Laura, maybe it's for the best. At her age, what kind of life would she have had? It was just a matter of time." She didn't even bother to turn down the volume of the TV. "Your father said he'd call the funeral home in the morning. Just stay there and sign whatever papers the hospital gives you. You know how those things work." She spoke about her mother-in-law the way someone talks about a broken washing machine that needs to be hauled to the curb. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just lowered the phone and let the sound of the game show fade into the distance as I walked toward the exit. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the parking lot. The wind was whipping off the Monongahela River, carrying a bitter, wet cold that sliced right through my OCPs. I found my Ford F-150 and climbed inside, the heavy door thudding shut and cutting off the world. I didn't lean over the steering wheel and sob. I didn't scream. My eyes were dry and hot. I opened my call history. I saw the entry. John Carr, 47 seconds. I pressed the power button and the volume up button simultaneously. Click. The screen flashed, capturing the evidence of his indifference. I opened my Notes app and created a new entry. I titled it, Sitrep, January 16th. The grieving granddaughter was gone. She had been pushed out of the room by the callousness of the people who were supposed to protect her. In her place sat a captain in the United States Army, a woman trained to identify threats, gather intelligence, and execute a mission with surgical precision. My parents thought they were delegating a chore to a tired nurse. They didn't realize they had just declared war on a professional. By 8 a.m. on January 17th, exactly 16 hours after Nana's heart stopped beating, the phone on my nightstand rattled against the wood. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know it was John. I stayed still for a moment, watching the gray Pittsburgh light filter through the blinds before I picked it up. There was no, "How are you holding up, Laura?" or "I'm so sorry we couldn't make it." Instead, my father's voice came through the speaker like a floor manager giving orders to a janitor on the night shift. "Look, Laura," he started, his voice already moving at a clip. "I've got a massive client meeting up in Scranton that I absolutely cannot move. It's a make-or-break deal for the firm." I heard the sound of a car door slamming on his end. Since you're already on emergency leave and your schedule is flexible, I need you to head over to Kowalski's funeral home and handle the arrangements. I'll wire you some money later to cover the basics. Just keep it simple. He didn't wait for me to agree. He didn't ask if I had eaten or slept. He just hung up. He was using my military service as an excuse again, treating my resilience like a tool he could use to avoid the messy, uncomfortable reality of his own mother's death. He wasn't busy. He was a deserter, leaving his daughter to police the battlefield while he hid in a corporate boardroom. An hour later, I was back at UPMC Presbyterian. I wasn't there for medical reasons this time. I was there to collect the wreckage. I stood at the security desk. My OCPs felt stiff and out of place in the morning rush of doctors and students. I asked the guard to print the visitor logs for the ICU from the last 48 hours. He didn't ask why. He just tapped a few keys, and the thermal printer began to hiss, a long, thin strip of paper curling out like a white tongue. I took the paper and walked toward the exit. I stopped under the bright, humming lights of the lobby to look at it. Under the column for authorized visitors, there was a vast, yawning sea of white space. Only one name appeared, scrawled in black ink across the void: Laura Carr. Badge number: A-1293. No John, no Diane, not even a distant cousin. It was a formal indictment, printed on hospital stationery, proving that for the last 2 days of her life, Nana had been effectively orphaned by her own children. I folded that paper until the edges were sharp, and I tucked it into my chest pocket, right over my heart. It wasn't a memento. It was a piece of intelligence. The Kowalski Funeral Home was an old, converted Victorian house on a quiet street, smelling of heavy floral arrangements and the sharp, cold sting of formaldehyde. Raymond, the director, sat behind a massive oak desk that looked like it had been there since the Great Depression. He wore a suit the color of wood ash, and he kept tapping his polished fingernails against a leather-bound catalog of caskets. It was a rhythmic, annoying sound that filled the quiet room. "Captain Carr, please accept my deepest sympathies," Raymond said, his voice a practiced, low-level hum. He pushed the catalog toward me. "Now, regarding the services, we need to discuss the burial plot, the viewing, and of course, the financial side of things. I'll need to know who will be responsible for the $9,000 balance." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my government-issued travel card. I was prepared to go into debt just to give Nana the dignity she deserved, even if it meant I wouldn't be able to afford a decent meal for the next 6 months. But Raymond held up a hand, stopping me before I could swipe it. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick folder with a bright red border. "That won't be necessary, Captain," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Mrs. Eleanor Carr came to see me 2 weeks ago. She was quite frail, leaning on her cane, but her mind was as sharp as a bayonet." He opened the folder to show me a series of receipts. She paid for everything: the casket, the plot, the headstone, even the flowers, all of it, in cash. I stared at the receipts. My hands started to feel cold. Nana had known. She had seen the neglect coming from a mile away, and she had moved to protect herself, and me, from the humiliation of begging John for help. Raymond leaned over the desk, his expression shifting from professional to something much more personal, something almost conspiratorial. "She came here alone," he whispered. "And she was very specific with her instructions. She told me, 'If my son John shows up, you are not to let him touch a single document. You do not let him make one decision.'" He pushed a small velvet-covered guest book toward me. "She also told me to give you a message, Laura. She said she left a series of sealed envelopes hidden back at her house. She told me to tell you that you must find them, all of them, before your parents set foot on that property." My pulse began to thud in my neck. I looked at the red-bordered file and then at Raymond's serious eyes. This wasn't just a funeral plan. This was an extraction mission. Nana hadn't just passed away quietly in the night. She had spent her final weeks laying a minefield for the people who had abandoned her, and she had handed me the map. My parents thought they were coming home to a house they could sell and a life they could erase. They had no idea that Nana had spent her last days making sure that the only thing waiting for them was the truth. I walked back to my truck, the cold air from the river feeling like a shot of adrenaline. I didn't feel like a grieving granddaughter anymore. I felt like a soldier who had just received her final set of orders. The battle was no longer about a hospital bed or a funeral bill. It was about the secrets hidden in those envelopes. I turned the ignition, the engine of the F-150 roaring to life, and I headed toward Nana's house. The war was officially moving to a new front. The sun was a pale, weak smudge hanging over the Monongahela River as I drove toward the south side. I pulled my truck up to Nana's small red brick house, the kind of place that had stood through decades of Pittsburgh steel and soot. I sat there for a second, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching the long shadows stretch across the porch. It felt wrong to use my key, like I was breaking into a sanctuary that had finally gone cold. When I finally stepped inside, the air hit me with the familiar heavy scent of cinnamon and Bengay ointment. It was the smell of my childhood, but now it felt like a museum of things left unsaid. I walked straight to the master bedroom, my boots thudding softly on the old hardwood floors. There, on the sewing machine table covered in a dusty canvas tarp, sat a plain light brown envelope. It was placed right under a small porcelain statue of the Virgin Mary, tucked away but impossible to miss if you knew where to look. Across the front, Nana had written in her sharp, elegant cursive, "Open if I do not come home." The date underneath was January 10th, 2025, just 6 days before the surgery that ended everything. My fingers felt thick and clumsy as I tore the edge of the envelope. A silver USB drive and a thick stack of disorganized papers spilled out onto the table like a confession. I started with the papers, my eyes scanning the dates and the medical letterheads. I felt a cold knot tightening in my stomach as I realized what I was looking at. It was a copy of her medical records from 2017, the year she had her first stroke. She had spent 42 days in recovery, 6 weeks of learning how to walk and speak again while I was stationed overseas. I pulled a yellow highlighter from my bag and started marking the visitor logs. In those 42 days of pain and isolation, my father, John Carr, had shown up exactly once. I stared at the entry. October 3rd, 2017. Time in, 11:04 a.m. Time out, 11:19 a.m. A 15-minute visit for a mother who had spent her life raising him. But it was the note in the margin that made my blood run cold. In Nana's shaky post-stroke handwriting, she had scribbled, "He spent 12 minutes asking me to sell the house. He didn't come to bring her flowers or check her vitals. He came to see if the assets were ready for harvest while she was still struggling to swallow water." I reached for my laptop, my jaw tight, and plugged in the silver USB drive. 7 audio files appeared on the screen, labeled only by dates. I clicked on the one from March 14th, 2019. The recording was grainy, filled with the static hum of a cheap device, but my father's voice was unmistakable. He sounded frantic, a thin layer of false desperation over his usual arrogance. He was begging for $3,500, claiming he needed it to fix his car to keep his job. I flipped through the bank receipts Nana had clipped together. There it was, a withdrawal slip for $3,200 from her modest retirement fund. In the corner, she'd written, "Promise to pay back soon." I kept scrolling, my eyes burning as I looked at a receipt from 2022. Another $1,800 for some emergency he never explained. At the bottom of that page, Nana had drawn a heavy red line. The words she wrote next were a death warrant for any lingering love I had for the man. Total $5,000. Never paid back. They had been bleeding her dry, cent by cent, while she was limping through her final years. They used her like an interest-free ATM while they posted photos of their summer vacations and expensive dinners. The rage didn't come as a scream. It came as a heavy, pressurized heat in my chest that turned my vision white. I slammed my fist onto the old wooden table, the sound echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. My eyes were dry, but my heart felt like it was being squeezed by a vice. I wasn't the grieving granddaughter anymore. I was Captain Laura Carr of the United States Army, and I had just been handed a complete intelligence dossier on a hostile target. I opened a new Excel spreadsheet on my laptop and titled it Targeting_Package_Car. I began to categorize the betrayals with the precision I had learned in the service. Column 1, the date. Column 2, the amount stolen. Column 3, The Evidence. I spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing her notes with the audio files, building a wall of facts that no lie could penetrate. I took 10 years of John Carr's cowardice and greed and compressed them into a single, devastating file. The weapon was loaded. I closed the laptop with a sharp click and looked over at the bed where my dress uniform lay, perfectly pressed and ready. My parents thought tomorrow's funeral was going to be a quiet goodbye and a quick house sale. They had no idea they were walking into a court-martial of their own making. I wasn't just going to bury my grandmother. I was going to bury their lies under the weight of the truth. January 23rd at St. Agnes Church felt less like a funeral and more like a carefully staged theater production. The air inside the sanctuary was heavy, a suffocating mix of old wood, melting beeswax candles, and the cloying synthetic trail of Diane's cheap Chanel perfume. There were 64 people scattered across the oak pews, neighbors who remembered Nana's sourdough bread and the postman who always had a treat for her cat. But my eyes were locked on the two people in the very center. At 10:28 a.m., John and Diane made their grand entrance. They were draped in perfectly tailored black wool, looking like the absolute picture of grieving heirs. John moved with a delicate, exaggerated limp, his arm anchored around Diane as he guided her toward the front. She was dabbing at her bone-dry eyes with a pristine white lace handkerchief, her shoulders shaking in a rhythmic, practiced sob that didn't quite reach her voice. John was working the room, stopping to shake hands with distant cousins he hadn't spoken to in a decade, whispering hollow, scripted phrases about a devastating loss and how they were holding on by a thread. I sat in the front pew, my spine as straight and rigid as a bayonet, my OCPs feeling like a second skin. I watched the vultures in mourning clothes perform their masterpiece of performative grief for a woman they had left to die alone in a hospital bed less than a week ago. Actually, looking back, the audacity of it was almost impressive. They really thought they were the leads in this play, but they didn't realize that the script had already been rewritten in Nana's kitchen weeks ago. Pastor Callahan stood at the pulpit, his hands resting on the weathered edges of the Bible. He had been Nana's friend for 30 years, a man who saw the truth through the fog of a small town. His eulogy was a quiet, 15-minute tribute to a woman who knew how to weather a storm. When he finished, he didn't step back to invite the family up to speak, which was the standard procedure. I saw John shift his weight, placing his hands on his thighs and leaning forward, ready to launch himself into the spotlight to give the son's tribute he had likely practiced in the car. He wanted the validation of the community. He wanted everyone to see him as the loyal patriarch of a grieving family. But Callahan didn't move. Instead, he reached into the deep, black pocket of his vestments and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a thick, jagged dollop of vivid red wax that caught the dim light of the stained glass. He tapped the microphone, the sound booming through the rafters like a gavel hitting a block. "Before we move to the final blessing," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of the church. Eleanor left behind a very specific set of final instructions. She requested that this letter not be read aloud today, but be delivered directly into the hands of Captain Laura Carr, effective immediately. The air in the church seemed to go cold. I heard the sharp rustle of fabric as John lurched to his feet. His mask of grief didn't just slip, it shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He took a step toward the pulpit, his face flushing a dark, angry purple, his hand outstretched as if he could simply snatch the document out of the air. "I'm her eldest son," he hissed, his voice loud enough to make the elderly women in the second row flinch and pull back. "If there's a letter from my mother, it belongs to me first. I have the legal right to see what she wrote before anyone else touches it." Callahan didn't blink. He looked down at my father with eyes as cold as a winter morning on the Allegheny River. "Eleanor's final wishes were incredibly clear, John," he said, and his voice was like a tolling bronze bell that filled every corner of the room. She stated that if John Carr was present at this service, he was to have no part in this delivery. Her exact words were, "Do not let him interfere. Now, please, sit down." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel 40 sets of eyes, maybe more, digging like needles into the back of John's neck. The perfect son, had just been publicly disowned in the house of God. Diane reached up and yanked violently on the hem of his jacket, her face pale with a mix of shock and pure, concentrated humiliation. John collapsed back into the pew, his jaw working as he stared at the floor, the red stain of shame creeping up from his collar. I stood up. My boots clicked sharply on the stone floor, the only sound in the entire building. I walked to the pulpit and took the envelope from the pastor's hand. The red wax felt cold and brittle under my thumb. I didn't open it there. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing my reaction. I walked down the side aisle, past the rows of stunned faces, and went straight into the small, cramped bathroom at the far end of the hallway. I turned the heavy iron bolt on the door with a satisfying click. The room smelled of bleach and old, iron-heavy plumbing. I took a single, deep breath and slid my fingernail under the edge of the wax seal. It cracked with a dry, sharp sound that seemed to tear right through the quiet of the morning. I pulled out a single sheet of Nana's heavy stationery. Her handwriting was bold, the letters tall and defiant, written with a hand that knew it was running out of time. "Laura," it began, "I know he only came because I am gone. He wants the house, not the mother who lived in it. I won't let him take the ground from under your feet. This house is yours, and yours alone. The legal deed has already been filed and notarized. Don't let them scare you." I looked at my reflection in the spotted, cracked mirror over the sink. My eyes were clear, my jaw was set, the play was finally over. John and Diane thought they were going back to Nana's house this afternoon to start packing her life into cardboard boxes and counting the silver. They had no idea that when they walked through that front door, they wouldn't be entering a family home. They'd be walking into a court-martial. And I was the presiding officer. If you have ever had to watch someone play the victim when you knew they were actually the villain, please leave a comment with the word justice, and let me know which state you are listening from. It helps me know there are others out there who have seen through the lies. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to see what happened when the front door finally opened this afternoon. The air in Nana's living room at 3:30 p.m. was thick enough to choke a horse. Imagine 22 people crammed into a space meant for 10. All of them nursing plastic cups of cheap, lukewarm Pinot Grigio, and picking at plates of reheated brisket that smelled faintly of hickory smoke and desperation. The house used to smell like cinnamon and fresh laundry, but now it was just the heavy, artificial scent of lemon air freshener trying to cover up the smell of grief and unwashed winter coats. I stood in the dead center of the room, my combat boots planted firmly on the worn wool rug, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Pastor Callahan stood by the front door like a sentry, his arms crossed, his presence a silent wall that blocked the only exit. John was perched in Nana's old wingback chair, legs crossed, swirling his wine with the smug, practiced air of a man who thought he had already won the lottery. He was playing the part of the grieving patriarch, leaning in to whisper, "I am doing my best," to a weeping aunt. I did not wait for the small talk to die down. I reached under my arm, pulled out a thick yellow manila folder, and slammed it onto the glass coffee table. The sound was a sharp crack that silenced the room instantly. The ice in the glasses stopped clinking. The chewing stopped. John's hand froze mid-swirl. "All right," I said, my voice carrying that low, dangerous vibration I usually reserved for privates who tried to lie to me in the field. "The theater is closed. It is time for the sitrep." I flipped open the first page. 6 weeks of recovery after Nana's stroke in 2017, I began, my words dropping like lead weights into a quiet pond. The eldest son of this family, the man sitting in that chair, visited exactly once. Total time spent, 15 minutes. And according to Nana's own notes, 12 of those minutes were spent trying to convince a woman who could not even hold a spoon yet to sign over the deed to this house. John bolted out of his chair like he had been stuck with a cattle prod. He slammed his own fist onto the table, his face turning a mottled, ugly shade of purple. "You shut your mouth. You have no right to talk to me that way. I am your father." Pastor Callahan did not say a word. He just stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on John's shoulder, forcing him back down into the velvet cushions. I did not blink. I flipped to the second page, pointing at the bank statements Nana had kept tucked away in her sewing room. 3 separate withdrawals in 2019. I said, projecting my voice so the cousins in the kitchen could hear. $5,000 in total, taken from a widow's pension under the guise of an emergency car repair. Nana wrote it down, John. Every cent. You never paid back a dime. You bled her dry while she was counting pennies for her heating bill. John was wheezing now, his chest heaving as he looked around the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face, anything to stop the bleeding. She has lost her mind. The army broke her, he shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate kind of arrogance. I did everything for that woman. I was her rock. That was the moment I pulled out the phone. I opened the gallery and pulled up the screenshot of the message from January 16th. I did not just read it, I held the screen up, walking a slow circle around the room so every person on every sofa could see the cold, blue light of the truth. This was his response while Nana was on the operating table. I said, my voice as cold as the snow piling up on the porch. You are already there. We will come if she actually passes away. My mother was dying, and he was waiting for the body to get cold so he could start the appraisal. The room erupted into a wave of horrified gasps. I saw Diane, my mother, sink into the shadows of the hallway, her face white, her hands shaking as she tried to hide behind a curtain. John's mouth hung open, but no sound came out. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the door, realizing that the community he had spent years grooming now saw him for exactly what he was, a parasite. You are trying to steal this place, he stammered, his finger trembling as he pointed at me. I stepped into his personal space, forcing him back against the floral wallpaper until he had nowhere left to go. This house has a new owner, John, I whispered, the words sharp and final. The deed has been filed. The keys are in my pocket. You have 5 minutes to get your things and leave my base of operations, or I am calling the police to have you removed for trespassing. John did not argue. He did not even look at Diane. He snatched his leather jacket from the hook by the door, nearly knocking over a vase in his haste, and practically fell down the porch steps. A moment later, the muffled roar of his Ford engine cut through the quiet, the tires spinning and screaming against the ice as he fled into the gray afternoon. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence return to the house. I closed the manila folder with a slow, deliberate snap. Target number 1 had been neutralized. But as I looked at the stunned faces of my relatives, I knew the war was not over. There were still secrets hidden in Nana's envelopes, and I was just getting started. Gerald Pruitt's office was tucked away in an old building downtown where the elevators still smelled like wet wool, stale tobacco, and floor wax. It was January 30th, 2025, 3 days after the funeral, and 3 days since I had watched my father flee into a Pittsburgh snowstorm like a whipped dog. Pruitt sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved out of a single piece of ancient, dark oak. He didn't say much as I sat down. He just pushed a small manila envelope across the polished wood toward me. Inside was another silver USB drive and a square yellow sticky note. Nana's handwriting was there, scratchy and sharp, the ink digging deep enough into the paper that I could feel the ridges on the back. It said, right corner, third shelf, the encyclopedia. I didn't wait to get home. I flipped open my ruggedized military laptop right there in his office, the screen casting a harsh blue glow across my face in the dim room. The drive contained a single video file titled Eleanor_confession.mp4. When I clicked play, Nana appeared on the screen. She was sitting in her old wingback chair, her face thin and pale, but her eyes were like flint. She was reading a formal statement about disinheriting her son. But as I watched, the military intelligence officer in me took over. I wasn't just listening to her words, I was analyzing the frame. The camera angle was too high and too steady. Nana was holding her own phone in her hand to record a backup, but this footage, this specific angle, was coming from somewhere else. A silent, unblinking eye was capturing the entire room, and I realized Nana had been running a surveillance operation right under my parents' noses. The drive back to the south side felt like a blur of gray slush and gritting my teeth. I didn't care about the speed traps on the parkway. I pulled up to the brick house, and for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a combat zone that needed to be swept for minds. I went straight to the library, the small dusty room where Nana kept her books and her sewing kits. I went to the oak shelves. Third shelf, right corner. There it was, the Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 14. I pulled it out. It was heavy, impossibly heavy for just paper and glue. I flipped the book over and ran my thumb along the spine. The leather was real, but the inner spine was a clever piece of hollowed-out plastic. Behind a pin-sized hole in the cover, a tiny coin-sized security camera blinked once with a weak, dying red light. Nana, a woman who had spent 40 years on the floor of a steel mill, had turned her living room into a wiretapped interrogation room. She hadn't just been waiting for me to come home and save her. She had spent her final months gathering the ammunition herself. I pulled the micro SD card from the device and took it to the kitchen table. My hands were cold as I plugged it into my laptop. There were over 200 hours of compressed footage, a digital map of a betrayal I wasn't prepared for. I scrubbed through the dates, my eyes straining against the screen until I stopped at December 19th, 2024. 11:32 a.m. Nana had been at the hospital for a pre-op checkup that day. The screen flickered with a bit of digital noise, and then I saw them, John and Diane. They walked into the living room like they were already the new owners, their boots leaving muddy streaks on Nana's clean rug. They weren't grieving, they were scouting the perimeter. Actually, it was the sound that broke me. The microphone on the cheap camera was grainy, but it picked up every word. I watched my mother, Diane, the woman I'd always viewed as a timid, long-suffering victim of my father's ego, walk over to a pair of antique porcelain vases on the mantel. She picked one up, turned it over to check the maker's mark on the bottom, and set it back down with a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot in the empty house. Her voice came through the speakers, cold and completely detached. "When do you think we can list the property?" she asked John. She sounded like a real estate agent, not a daughter-in-law. "The market in this neighborhood is hitting $500,000 now. If we move fast on the probate, we can make that Europe trip in April." John just laughed, a wet, ugly sound that made my stomach turn. He reached out and tucked a small bronze statue of a soldier into his coat pocket. "She won't last the winter, Diane," he said. "We just need to push the paperwork through while she's still in that confused state." The video kept playing, but I couldn't hear it anymore. The blood in my veins felt like it had turned to freezing slush. Every memory I had of my mother, her quiet smiles, her soft, "I understand" during my phone calls from overseas, shattered. She wasn't the good parent. She was the one who had weaponized my own sacrifice to cover her tracks. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it was a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting my father. I was fighting a tag team of predators who had been waiting for the woman who gave them everything to finally stop breathing. I picked up my phone. My hand didn't shake, but my heart was a heavy, dull hammer in my chest. I dialed Gerald Pruitt's private line. It was late, but I knew he was waiting. "Mr. Pruitt," I said, my voice dropping into that low, jagged tone I used when a mission went south. "I found it. I have the footage. Load every piece of ammunition we have. All of it. We aren't just filing a civil suit for the house anymore. We're going to the district attorney. I want them both destroyed." I closed the laptop with a snap that echoed through the empty house. The war was no longer about a deed or a bank account. It was about justice for a woman who had to turn her own home into a trap just to be heard. By February 3rd, 2025, the reality of losing a $500,000 asset had finally stripped away the last of my father's common sense. John Carr couldn't just walk away from a payday that large. Instead of retreating, he launched a desperate, muddy counterattack. He filed a formal suit in the Allegheny County Courthouse, seeking to invalidate Nana's original will. His legal argument was as thin as tissue paper. He claimed Nana had been suffering from age-related cognitive decline, and that I, as a military officer trained in psychological operations, had manipulated her into signing over the deed. He showed up with a lawyer in a cheap, shiny polyester suit and a set of documents he claimed was a revised will, dated January 28th, 2 days after Nana had already passed. He expected me to be a typical daughter, someone who would be terrified of a subpoena and a public scandal. He didn't realize he had just marched his entire life into a federal minefield. On February 10th, Gerald Pruitt called me into his office for a pre-flight check. Sitting in the guest chair was Kathleen Briggs, a notary public who had been working in our small town for 35 years. She looked exactly like the kind of woman you didn't want to lie to. Gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, glasses on a chain, and a mouth that looked like it hadn't smiled since the Reagan administration. She pushed a signed affidavit across the desk. "Your father came to my office on the afternoon of the 28th, Kathleen said, her voice dripping with a very specific kind of professional disgust. "He handed me that 50-50 will and a $500 bill. He told me to backdate the stamp so it looked like your grandmother signed it before she went into surgery." She leaned forward, her eyes as sharp as needles. "I've compared the signatures, Captain. That wasn't your grandmother's hand. It was a clumsy, shaky forgery." John Carr wasn't just greedy anymore. He had officially committed a felony. The final showdown happened on April 3rd, 2025, in courtroom number 4. The room smelled of old paper, rain-dampened wool, and the heavy metallic scent of floor wax. I wasn't wearing my work uniform this time. I was in my dress blues. My medals were polished to a mirror finish, my belt was cinched tight, and my white shirt was stiff with starch. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my back straight, looking every bit the officer Nana wanted me to be. Across the aisle, John sat slumped in his chair, his collar already dark with a ring of nervous sweat. Every time the projector flashed a new image onto the screen, he seemed to shrink an inch. Gerald Pruitt didn't just present a case, he executed a tactical strike. The first magazine of evidence was the ICU visitor log. 42 days of absence, punctuated by a single 15-minute visit to harass a stroke victim. The second was the bank statements. $5,000 bled from a widow's pension for car repairs that were never repaid. The third was the encyclopedia camera footage. The 11:32 a.m. recording of John and Diane scouting the living room and planning their Europe trip while the woman who owned the house was still breathing. And then, the killing blow. Kathleen Briggs took the stand and detailed the attempted bribe and the forged signature. I watched John's lawyer put his pen down and simply rub his face with both hands. He knew he was representing a man who had dug his own grave and was now asking for a shovel. Judge Rossi didn't even wait for the closing arguments. He was an old-school jurist with a voice like gravel in a blender. He took off his glasses, looked down from the bench at my father, and the silence in the room was so thick you could hear the radiator clicking in the corner. "Mrs. Carr left behind a record of betrayal that is more thorough than most police investigations I've seen in this county," Rossi declared. He picked up his wooden gavel and brought it down with a sharp, echoing crack that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "This suit is dismissed with prejudice. And Mr. Carr, I'm referring the evidence of forgery and attempted bribery to the district attorney's office effective this afternoon." John Carr stood up so fast his chair flipped over backward, the loud thud echoing through the oak-paneled room. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Diane, who was sitting in the back row with her head in her hands. He just scrambled for the exit, his boots skidding on the polished floor as he fled the courtroom to avoid the deputies. He was a man who had been socially and legally erased from the family he tried to plunder. I stood up slowly, adjusted my jacket, and looked at the empty seat where my father had just been. The war was won. The house was safe. But as the courtroom cleared and the lights were dimmed, I felt a strange, hollow quiet settling over me. I was a soldier who had successfully defended the base, but I was standing in a field of ruins. By June 15th, 2025, the dust from the legal battlefield had settled, leaving a silence in Nana's brick house that no longer felt heavy, but clean. I was sitting in the kitchen, the morning sun cutting through the blinds in sharp, golden slats, when my phone buzzed on the granite countertop. The name on the screen made my pulse skip a beat, then go cold. Diane Carr. I didn't pick it up immediately. I watched it vibrate, a mechanical intrusion into my peace, before I finally tapped the speaker button and tossed the phone back onto the table. I didn't say hello, I just waited. The sound that came through the speaker was a sharp, jagged intake of breath, followed by the familiar, wet sound of a practiced sob. "Laura, I've done it. I filed for divorce from John," Diane whispered, her voice trembling with the calculated fragility of a professional victim. She went on for minutes, a torrential downpour of excuses and finger-pointing. She told me she couldn't live with his cruelty anymore. She claimed she had only gone along with his plans because she was terrified of him, that she was just another one of his casualties. She was fishing for an olive branch, a ticket back into the $500,000 sanctuary I now owned. She wanted me to tell her it wasn't her fault. I sat there, tapping a rhythmic beat against the stone with my fingernails, waiting for the performance to end. When she finally paused, her breathing heavy and expectant, I leaned in closer to the microphone. My voice was a flat, low-frequency hum. "Are you calling because you're sorry, Diane, or because you lost the house?" The line went dead quiet. The fake sobbing stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. I didn't give her time to regroup. "I watched the footage from December 19th, I said, my words dropping like iron slugs. "I saw you standing by the mantel, checking the value of the vases while Nana was in the hospital. I heard you planning a trip to Europe with her death as the travel fund. You weren't scared of John. You were his architect." Diane started to stammer, her voice rising an octave in a desperate attempt to reclaim the moral high ground. "Laura, regardless of what happened, I am still your mother." I didn't let her finish. I reached out and slid my thumb across the red icon on the screen. Click. The room returned to its perfect morning stillness. I didn't just hang up, I blocked her number. It wasn't an act of anger, it was a surgical excision. The final tumor had been removed from my life, and I finally understood that family is a title you earn through loyalty, not something you're entitled to through a birth certificate. By February 14th, 2026, the house had been transformed. It was no longer a crime scene of neglect. It was a fortress. I spent the morning hanging a new frame in the living room, right where John and Diane had once scouted their plunder. I drove a single, heavy steel nail into the wall and hung a frame made of solid, dark oak. Inside wasn't a staged family portrait. It was the original copy of Nana's medical power of attorney and the court order stripping John Carr of every legal right he ever thought he had. Below it, I mounted a small brushed brass plaque that caught the light. It read, "Dignity at the end of life is seized, not inherited." I called it the Wall of Honor. 2 weeks later, on February 28th, a brutal Pittsburgh snowstorm was rattling the window panes, trying to find a way inside. I was dressed in my working OCPs, my boots laced tight, sitting at the dining room table. I was holding an old, chipped ceramic mug, the one Nana used for 40 years at the steel mill, filled with coffee so hot the steam blurred my vision. This wasn't the spilled, cold mess from the day I got the call in the ICU. This was a cup I held with steady hands. On my laptop, the dashboard for the Eleanor Carr Dignity Fund was glowing. I had used the proceeds from the sale of the extra land. Nana left me to build what I called a quick reaction force, a team of lawyers and nurses who specialized in rescuing seniors from financial and emotional predators. By that morning, we had already pulled 43 people out of the same shadows Nana had lived in. We were the cavalry that never showed up for her, but we were showing up for them. I reached for my phone and opened a saved audio file I'd extracted from the hidden camera. It wasn't a recording of a betrayal. It was a clip from a month before she died, a moment when she thought she was alone in the kitchen. Her voice came through the speaker, clear and humming a low tune, before she spoke to the empty room as if I were standing right there. "Laura, I know you'll find this. I know you'll be the one to stand at the door for me. I love you, baby. Thank you for being my soldier." I took a slow sip of the bitter black coffee and looked out at the white-out conditions in the yard. The wind was howling, but inside this house, it was quiet. I wasn't a victim anymore, and I wasn't just a granddaughter. I was the guardian of a legacy that no amount of greed could ever touch. I set the mug down on a coaster, the sound a solid, final thud against the wood. The mission was complete. Laura's journey serves as a powerful reminder that an individual's true value is never determined by the recognition, or lack thereof, from a toxic family. While blood defines a biological connection, It does not mandate a lifetime of silent suffering or the endurance of betrayal. Resilience is a person's most precious asset, allowing them to transform deep-seated hurt into a driving force for meaningful, positive change. By establishing firm boundaries, a person chooses their own peace over a toxic forgiveness that only serves to enable further harm. Ultimately, everyone possesses the power to self-define their worth and build a chosen family rooted in genuine respect and honor. If Laura's story resonated with your own experiences of standing guard alone or fighting for systemic justice, please share your perspective in the comments below. These shared accounts of resilience help build a supportive community where no one feels isolated in their struggle against family injustice. If you found value in this journey of reclaiming dignity and setting boundaries, please support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing for more stories of courage. How have you defined your own wall of honor in your life? Let us know in the comments. Your voice is a vital part of this community.